Hello and welcome to the first day of The Last Dog. Please note that on this assignment, this will take 2 days. So we will be starting it on Tuesday and finishing it on Wednesday. So the first day of our reading, we're looking at some introductory phrases and ideas to go along with short stories. So today we're going to be learning parts of a short story, including setting, characters, plot, and conflict. And we're going to learn how to apply them to the story The Last Dog. And then we're also going to be using context clues to figure out vocabulary and definitions. Okay, so if I come to this page, we have 2 different documents here that we can look at. So I'm first going to click on the left one, and then we'll examine the right one. So when we open the first document, we come down to this elements of plot and literary terms. So the ones that you really need to be aware of are the introduction and exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, conclusion, and then the setting. Okay, and if you're looking at a plot line, this is kind of how they go. And we'll pull these up on the other plot line in a moment. We're also going to want to know about the protagonist and the antagonist. We're going to know about dynamic and static characters, meaning characters that change and characters that stay the same. Flat and round are kind of the same. And then your various different types of conflicts. All right, so this has all of that information. It also has points of view, and it has the types of narrators. First person, second person, we very rarely see. So first person, you are in the eyes of the character. You know that because they say I, me, we. And third person is someone who is outside, and they are able to look and see everything that's going on. Okay, so I'm going to open up the other document, and we'll review some of these terms. All right, so I opened up the second document. So this one is the one I actually wanted to go through the definitions with you so that you have them, but it also shows where they end up fitting with regards to the plot line. So some universal things that we should know are who is the protagonist in our story. So that's the main character in a story, the character that the story revolves around. This is usually considered the quote-unquote good guy. All right. Usually they go through some sort of change and evolve as the story goes on, and usually they have to make some sort of change in order to be the protagonist. The antagonist is the character who is in conflict with the protagonist. They're usually the one who creates the conflict, and they usually don't change throughout the story. They're just kind of the one that makes the protagonist's life a little more difficult. With regards to conflict, this is the problem within the story. When the conflict is solved or resolved, it is usually the climax, which we'll get to up here. There are several different forms of conflict. So person versus themselves, person versus person. So when 2 people are in an argument, person versus society. So when it's one person against the whole of society, or person versus nature. So when you have a situation like a hurricane or a tornado or something along those lines where nature is the antagonist, then that would be person versus nature. So when we're looking at our plot line, we're looking at some various different pieces. So this bottom section that's down on the bottom is called the introduction or the exposition. This is where you get introduced to your characters, your setting, which is where and when the story takes place. The conflict may also be established in the beginning of the story, but it doesn't always have to be. Sometimes that shows up in the rising action. You have an inciting incident somewhere in your story, which is the event that gets the story started and makes the readers want to continue reading. So this is where the conflict begins. Okay, so this is when we see the first hint of conflict. Now, like I said, that could be in the beginning or in the rising action, which is a series of events that eventually build up to the climax. The characters and conflict are further developed and events begin to get complicated. Once you get to the climax, which is the highest point of the story, it's the most exciting part, this is usually the turning point, and it's usually where the conflict gets resolved, or something really major happens in the story at this point. Then you have the falling action. Now, you don't always get falling action, or sometimes you get just a little bit of information at the very end, and sometimes you get a couple chapters worth. So it really depends. The falling action or the denouement is just where the events and the conflict begin to be resolved. Everything, all the loose ends get tied up, and the story ends at its conclusion. All right, so it can be happy, it can be sad, can be surprising, even can leave on a cliffhanger for that matter. All right, so these are the types of things that you are going to be responsible for filling out on your sheet today. So when you are done reading the story, or as we are going with the story, all right, we will find the bits and pieces that we need to do to fill in the different parts of this worksheet. So you will have all of these definitions, and then below them you will have a spot where you fill in what you need to fill in on the worksheet. All right, so now that we've gone over that basic information, we're going to read The Last Dog by Katherine Paterson. And you don't have to answer the questions that are on the PDF document where the reading is found. We'll go over parts of that together in class. I may stop during the video and explain those to you, but all you have to do is fill in your blank plot line. You do not have to fill in any of those questions. All right. The setting for this story is very important. All right. The setting takes place on a planet, probably Earth, but we're not sure. Takes place in the future where people live under a dome to seal out toxic gases. All right, so this brings you to the idea that there was some sort of apocalypse where society as we knew it, kind of fell apart. So you have to think, how might this isolation affect people? And if you have to, think about that, think about how did being in isolation during COVID affect you? All right, so we see kind of what might look like the dome that's in the story, but we see some crops growing here. But if everything outside the dome is dead and desolate, then how are they going to get their food? How are they going to, control their indoor climate? What is that going to mean for them? And how is that going to affect their psyche or their psychological nature? How is that going to affect them when they are stuck inside of this isolated area? Some things to think about when we are reading today, some of the text features. At the bottoms of pages, you will have vocabulary boxes. So when you're reading and you see a word that's in bold, look at the bottom and that will give you your vocabulary. On the sides, you may have some questions that are meant to make people think or guiding ideas. And then you may see some things in yellow that are just more guiding questions. There are more things to keep in mind. There are more things to just make the reading a little more whole for you. All right, so we're going to start our story. It's been written by Katherine Paterson, and as we kind of talked about in class, it's about a boy who lives in a dome on a planet that we later find out is most likely Earth, but due to whatever circumstances in the past, there's poisonous gases in the atmosphere and poisonous water, and people don't leave the dome without this protective suit, such as our character Brock has on here in this picture. So periodically, I'm going to stop. There will be vocab at the bottom of the screen, so if you don't know what something is, you can always look it up on your copy, or you can wait till I scroll to the bottom of the screen. Brock approached the customs gate. Although he did not reach for the scanner, a feeling, it might have been labeled excitement, made him tremble. His fingers shook as he punched in his number on the inquiry board. "This is highly irregular Brock 0956700038, the disembodied voice said. "What is your reason for external travel?" Brock took a deep breath. "Scientific research," he replied. He didn't need to be told that his behavior was irregular. He'd never heard of anyone doing research outside the dome, actual rather than virtual research. I've been cleared by my podmaster and the research team." Estimated time of return? So he wasn't to be questioned further. 1800 hours, which is 6 p.m. in non-military time. "Are you wearing the prescribed dry suit with helmet and gloves?" "Affirmative." "You should be equipped with 750 milliliters of liquid and food tablets for 1 day of travel." "Affirmative." Brock patted the sides of his dry suit to be sure. "Remember to drink sparingly. Water supply is limited." Brock nodded. He tried to lick his parched lips, but his whole mouth felt dry. "Is that understood?" "Affirmative." Was he hoping customs would stop him? If he was, they didn't seem to be helping him. Well, this was what he wanted, wasn't it? To go outside the dome? turn on the universal locator Brock 0956700038 and proceed to the gate. So basically we've got this situation where Brock is leaving the compound for the first time, and we find out this is a very unusual situation for anybody in his compound, let alone, for one kid to go out on his own. Why weren't they questioning him further? Were they eager for him to go? Ever since he'd said out loud in group speak that he wanted to go outside the dome, people had treated him strangely. That session with the podmaster and then the interview with the representative from research? Did they think he was a deviant? Deviants sometimes disappeared. The word was passed around that they had gone outside, but no one really knew. No deviant had ever returned. So the word deviant is usually used for people who do immoral things or things that are wrong or things that people in society think are wrong. So the idea is, whenever someone in the society does something wrong, they think it's just a dirty, nasty thing. Could be something as simple as questioning the government or asking to go outside. But then what happens to them is they disappear. They go outside the dome, but they never come back and no one knows what happens to them. All right. So in this society, whoever's ruling the community has ultimate control over what's going on and what is said and questioned. The gate slid open before he was quite ready for it. Brock found himself outside the protection of the dome. He blinked. The sun, at least it was what he was called the sun in virtual lessons, was too bright for his eyes, even inside the tinted helmet. He took a deep breath, one last backward look at the dome, which, with the alien sun gleaming on it, was even harder to look at than the distant star, and started across an expanse of brown soil. Was it? To what he recognized from holograms as a line of purplish mountains in the distance. It was. He pulled the scanner from his outside pouch and checked it. Hot. Oh, that was what he was feeling. Hot. He remembered hot from a virtual lesson he had had once on deserts. He wanted to take off the dry suit, but he had been told since he could remember that naked skin would suffer irreparable burning outside the protection of the dome. He adjusted the control as he walked so that the unfamiliar perspiration would evaporate. He fumbled a bit before he found the temperature adjustment function. He put it on 20 degrees centigrade and immediately felt more comfortable. No one he really knew had ever left the dome, stories of deviants exiting the dome being hard to verify. But there was all this equipment in case someone decided to venture out. He tried to ask the clerk who outfitted him, but the woman was evasive. The equipment was old, she said. People used to go out, but the outside environment was threatening, so hardly anyone, she looked at him carefully now, hardly anyone ever used it now. All right, so he is used to being in a very climate-controlled atmosphere. He's not used to sweating. That's like a new experience for him. And his suit that he is wearing has an air conditioning unit in it. And it says he sets it to 20 degrees Celsius, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what we measure our temperature in. So it's about the standard, what you would keep your house at or our classrooms, that's about the temperature that he's at. And then the idea that he realizes no one's ever been outside, yet they still have this equipment. And the woman kind of looks at him weird, and she's like, well, hardly anyone ever uses it. And she kind of gives him that, except you type of thing, without saying it. All right. Was Brock then the only normal person still curious about the outside? Or had all those who had dared to venture out perished, discouraging further forays? Perhaps he was a deviant for wanting to see the mountains for himself. When he'd mentioned it to others, they had laughed. But there was a hollow sound to the laughter. If he never returned, he had no one to blame but himself. He knew that. While his pod fellows played virtual games, he'd wandered into a subsection of the historical virtuals called ancient fictions. Things happen in these fictions more densely than they did in the virtuals. The people he met there, it was hard to describe, but somehow they were more actual than the dome dwellers. They had strange names like Huck Finn and MC Higgins the Great. They were even a little scary. It was their insides. Their insides were very loud. But even though the people in the ancient fictions frightened him a bit, he couldn't get enough of them. When no one was paying attention, he went back again and again to visit them. They had made him wonder about that other world, that world outside the dome. Perhaps once he realized the danger the ancient fictions posed, he should have left them alone. But he couldn't help himself. They made him feel hollow, hungry for something no food pellet or even virtual experience could satisfy. And now he was in the world they spoke of, and the mountains of it were in plain view. So he goes back into these things called historical fictions, which are basically just novels. Huckleberry Finn was a novel written by Mark Twain in the 1800s. So he goes back and he meets characters from these novels in a virtual type of way. And, you know, he thinks about their world outside of the dome. And one of the questions down here is, what might Brock ask these people of the other world? And that idea that maybe he would ask them what their life was like. What sort of things did they do? What was it like outside a dome? He's only known this dome his entire life. Asking them anything about their lives would satiate or get rid of his curiosity. And he says he realized that it was dangerous to see these things. And the danger is not that they're physically dangerous, but now they're making him wonder things. Everybody else plays video games and kind of sits around and follows their virtual lesson that their computer has taught them, very much like we are now. But the idea that he questions things. No one in society questions anything except this one random boy. And now that's kind of setting him apart from everyone. He headed for the purple curves within a short distance from the dome. The land was clear and barren, but after he had been walking for an hour or so, he began to pass rusting hulks and occasional ruins of what might have been the dwellings of ancient peoples that no one in later years had cleared away from recycling or vaporization. So sort of what we're starting to see here is he's actually on Earth. All right, these are old structures from people, however many years ago. He keeps calling it ancient times. So we don't know exactly what time period this story takes place, but he's talking about our time right now, and probably beyond that, when obviously something would have happened to clear everything out of its existence. He checked the emotional scanner for an unfamiliar sensation. Loneliness, it registered. He rather liked having names for these new sensations. It made him feel a bit proud, was it? The scanner was rather interesting. He wondered when people had stopped using them. He hadn't known they existed until in that pod meeting. He had voiced his desire to go outside. It also indicates that they don't really have names for emotions. They don't process emotions in his time, so he has this ancient scanner that he's using that gives him the words for the feelings that he has. The podmaster had looked at him with raised eyebrow and a sniff. Next thing you'll be asking for a scanner, he said. What's a scanner? Brock said. The podmaster requisitioned one from storage, but at the same time he must have alerted research because it was the representative from research who had brought him the scanner and questioned him about this expressed desire for an actual adventure, a journey outside the dome. What has prompted this unusual ambition? The representative had asked. His eyes not on Brock, but on the scanner in his hand. Brock had hesitated, distracted by the man's fidgeting with the strange instrument. I'm interested in scientific research, Brock said at last. So here he was, out of the pod, alone for the first time in his life. Perhaps, though, he should have asked one of the pod fellows to come along, or even the pod robopet. But the other fellows all laughed when he spoke of going outside, their eyes darting back and forth. Nothing on the outside, they said, could equal the newest virtual adventure. He suddenly realized that ever since he started interfacing with the ancient fictions, his fellows had given him that look. They did think he was odd, not quite the same as a regular pod fellow. Brock didn't really vibe with the pod robopet. It was one of the more modern ones, and when they'd programmed its artificial intelligence, they'd somehow made it too smart. The Robo-Pet in the child's pod last year was older, stupider, and more fun to have around. He'd badly underestimated the distance to the mountains. The time was well past noon, and he had at least 3 kilometers left to go. That's a little more than a mile and a half. Should he signal late return or turn about now? He didn't have much more than one day's scant supply of water and food tablets, but he was closer to the hills than the dome. He felt a thrill, excitement, and pressed on. So what we're sort of getting here is the idea that he is raised in a pod with other people. We'll find out a little bit more about that later. But the idea that he is the only one that actually wants an actual adventure. And up here it asks, what kind of conflict do we see so far? So we're seeing a couple of different types of conflict right now. Remember, conflict is a problem. So we're seeing that conflict of character versus society, where he is different than everyone else in his society, and people are looking at him strange. He feels kind of like an outsider, like he doesn't belong, and that causes an internal conflict for him to struggle with himself. He keeps second-guessing himself. He keeps questioning the things that he's doing. He keeps going, am I a deviant? Because he doesn't know. And he's kind of worried about what these other people are thinking of him. And that's causing this kind of internal struggle for him as well. So we've got these two different types of conflict going on in this story. There were actual trees growing on the first hill, not the great giants of virtual lessons, more scrubby and bent, but they were trees. He was sure of it. The podmaster had said that trees had been extinct for hundreds of years. Brock reached up and pulled off a leaf. It was green and had veins. In some way, it looked like his own hand. He put the leaf in his pack to study later. He didn't want anyone accusing him of losing his scientific objectivity. Only deviants did that. Farther up the hill, he heard an unfamiliar burbling sound. No, he knew that sound. It was water running. He'd heard it once when the liquid dispenser had malfunctioned. There'd been a near panic in the dome over it. He checked the scanner. There was no caution signal, so he hurried toward the sound. It was a brook. He was sure of it. Virtual lessons had taught him that there were such things outside in the past, but that they had long ago gone poisonous, and then, in the warming climate, had dried up. But here was a running brook, not even a 4-hour journey from his home. His first impulse was to take off his protective glove and dip it in a finger. But he drew back. He had been well conditioned to avoid danger. He sat down clumsily on the bank. Yes, this must be grass. There were even some tiny flowers mixed in the grass. Would the atmosphere poison him if he unscrewed his helmet to take a sniff? He punched the scanner to read conditions, but the characters on the scanner panel danced about uncertainly until, at length, the disembodied voice said, "Conditions unreadable." He'd better not risk it. He pushed the buttons now for liquid and pellets. A tube appeared in his mouth. It dropped a pellet on his tongue, and from the tube he sucked liquid enough to swallow his meal. What was it they called outside nourishment in the history virtuals? A picnic? Something like that. He was having a picnic in the woods by a brook. A hasty consulting of the scanner revealed that what he was feeling was pleasure. He was very glad he hadn't come with an anxious podfellow or worse, an advanced robo-pet that would no doubt be yanking at his suit already, urging him back toward the dome. All right, so now that he's out here, even though he's kind of scared and doesn't know what to expect, he's glad to be by himself. He wants to experience this without some, robot dog yanking at him or one of his other podfellows just being nervous and scared all the time. And he's finding all of these natural things that we take for granted because we see every day, like trees and grass and flowers and water. It was then, in the middle of the post-picnic satisfaction, that he heard the new sound, like that programmed into a robo-pet, yet different. He struggled to his feet. The dry suit from storage was certainly awkward when you wanted to stand up or sit down. Nothing on the scanner indicated danger, so he went to the scrubby woods toward the sound and stopped abruptly. Something was lying under the shadow of a tree, something about 1 meter long, that's about 3 feet. It was furred and quite still. The sound was not coming from it. He saw the small dog, and then he saw the small dog, the puppy. He was sure it was a puppy, nosing the stiff body of what must have once been its mother, making the little crying sounds he'd heard from the brook. Later, much later, he realized that he should have been wary. If the older dog had died of some extradomal disease, the puppy might have been a carrier, but at the time all he could think of was the puppy, a small creature who had lost its mother. He had found out about mothers from the virtuals. Mothers were extinct in the dome. Children were conceived and born in the lab and raised in units of 12 in the pods, presided over by a bank of computers and the podmaster. Nuclear families, as everyone knew, had been wasteful of time, energy, and space. There was an old proverb, the key to survival is efficiency. So though Brock could guess the puppy was sad, like that fictions person Joe, whose podmate expired, he didn't know what missing a mother would feel like, and who would whimper for a test tube. So, we just find out here that Brock doesn't have a mother or father. He's created in a test tube in a lab. He grows up with other children his age in one pod, kind of like dormitory style. And so he doesn't know what it would be like to lose a parent like this. But he can imagine this puppy sad, and he can imagine that because he's seen it in the historical fictions. Now this one here that says Joe, whose podmate expired, I'm not exactly sure what they're referring to, but this could definitely be a reference to the story Little Women, because this spelling of Joe is usually a shortened version of like Josephine. And in that book, Josephine March, who's the lead character, she loses her sister. So it might have been a story that he read, and that was also written in the 1800s, around about the Civil War era. All right. Brock had never seen a dog, of course, but he had seen plenty of dog breed descriptions on the Science History virtuals. Dogs had been abundant once. They filled the ancient fictions. They even had names there, Lassie, Toto, Sounder. But now dogs were extinct. Gone during the Dark Ages when the atmosphere had become warm and poisonous. The savages, who had not had the intelligence or wealth to join the foresighted dome crafters, had killed all the animals, wild or domesticated, for food before they had eventually died out themselves. It was all in one of the very first virtual lessons. He had seen that one many times. He never confessed to anyone how, sad it made him feel. All right, so we have this idea that he has been presented in the dome, that anybody who would not go into the dome when they had the chance to were savages, and that they ate all the animals in existence until the animals and the people went extinct. However, we now have a dog that's out in, reality out there. So if the mother, the dog's mother and the puppy were existing, then there's a chance that there are other animals out there. They had to come from somewhere. And if there's a chance there's other animals, there's also a chance there's other people too. His society, his government might be telling him one thing, but it might not be the truth, or they may be mistaken. Who knows? But obviously, dogs were not quite extinct. Cautiously, he moved toward the small one. Alert, alert, scanning unknown object. Brock pushed the off button. Are you sure you want to turn off scanner? Affirmative. He stuck the scanner in his pouch. The puppy had lifted its head at the sound of his voice. It looked at him, head cocked, as though deciding whether to run or stay. It's all right, dog, Brock said soothingly. I won't hurt you. He stayed still. He wouldn't want to be frightened, the little beast. He wouldn't want to frighten the little beast. If it ran, he wasn't sure he'd be able to catch it in the clumsy dry suit. Slowly, he extended his gloved hand. The dog backed away anxiously, but when Brock kept the hand extended, the puppy slowly crept toward him and sniffed, making whimpering sounds. It wasn't old enough to be truly afraid, it seemed. The pup licked his glove tentatively and then backed away again. It was looking for food, and plasticine gloves weren't going to satisfy. Brock looked first at the dead mother, whose source of nourishment must have long dried up, and then around the landscape. What would a dog eat? A puppy on its own. He took off his glove and reached through his pouch into the inside pocket that held his pellet supply. Making every move slow and deliberate so as not to startle the dog, He held out a pellet. The dog came to his hand, licked it, then the pellet. It wrinkled its nose. Brock laughed. He didn't need the scanner now to tell that what he felt was pleasure. He loved the feel of the rough tongue on his palm and the little furred face questioning him. "It's all right, fellow, you can eat it." As though understanding, the pup gulped down the pellet, then looked around for more, not realizing that it had just bolted down a whole meal. When the dog saw that there was no more coming, it ran over to the brook. Brock watched in horror as it put its head right down into the poisonous stream and lapped it noisily. "Don't!" Brock cried. The puppy turned momentarily at the sound and then went back to drinking as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Well, it was for the dog. Where else would a creature in the wild get liquid? If the streams were not all dried up, they must have learned to tolerate the water. But then it was breathing the poisoned atmosphere, wasn't it? Why hadn't it hit Brock before? This was a fully organic creature on the outside without any life support system. What could that mean? Some amazing mutation must have occurred, making it possible for at least some creatures to breathe the outside atmosphere and drink its poisoned water. Those who couldn't died. Those who could survived and got stronger. Even the ancient scientist Darwin knew that, and Brock had come upon one of these magnificent mutants. So what other questions might Brock ask about the foreign environment is it really poisonous? Is this dog mutated to accept it? Or is the atmosphere fine? Is the water not poison? That's something he would definitely want to look into. The puppy whimpered and looked at Brock with large, trusting eyes. How could he think of it as a mutant specimen? It was a puppy, one who had lost its mother. What would it eat? There was no sign of food for a carnivore. All right, and we have this cute little picture of the dog and whatnot. All right, so this is the end of part 1, and we will pick this back up again at part 2. Now that you've finished, make sure to go and fill out the form with the reading check questions. Have a great day, and I'll see you on the next part.